The Warren-Matson Debate. Dr. Thomas B. Warren, Ph.D., is professor of the philosophy of religion and Christian apologetics at the Harding Graduate School in Memphis, Tennessee. Dr. Wallace I. Matson, Ph.D., is professor of philosophy at the University of California at Berkeley. This debate was held at the Curtis-Hixson Convention Hall in Tampa, Florida, on September the 11th through the 14th, 1978. We present the Warren-Matson Debate on the existence of God. The propositions for this debate are as follows. The first proposition reads, I know that God, that is, the God in the New Testament, who is to punish some individuals eternally in hell, does not exist. Dr. Wallace I. Matson is in the affirmative, and Dr. Thomas B. Warren is in the negative of this proposition. The second proposition reads, I know that God, that is, the God of the New Testament, who is to punish some individuals eternally in hell, does exist. Dr. Thomas B. Warren is in the affirmative, and Dr. Wallace I. Matson is in the negative of this proposition. This production was directed and videotaped by Dr. Rex A. Turner, Jr. and by Dr. Curtis A. Cates, administrators and professors of the Alabama Christian School of Religion, Montgomery, Alabama. This film has been copyrighted and reproduced by the National Christian Press, Incorporated. Any reproductions, use, or sale of this film without written permission from the authorized representative of the National Christian Press is strictly prohibited.
Dr. Matson, gentlemen moderators, ladies and gentlemen. Well, friends, if it had not been for the lack of tact, I would have thought I'd been listening to Dr. Flew. I think every point that he got from Dr. Flew in our debate. Didn't say anything new except that he used an illustration regarding Latin that Dr. Flew did not use. Otherwise, he made exactly the same effort at trying to avoid the responsibility of telling us not when. That wasn't what I asked, Dr. Matson. I do wish you would listen more carefully, please. I did not ask when did human beings come into existence, but I asked how did they come into existence? How did they come into existence when there was at one time nothing, according to your admission, but non-living matter? How did life come in the light of your admission in your book that there is no such thing as spontaneous generation? No life comes except from seed. How much have you heard him say about that? Dr. Matson, Cornell University Press will surely be interested in your repudiation of that position. You now are saying that life has come from non-life, just as you're saying that that human life has come from non-human life. But what explanation did you tell us as to how it came? Oh, he seeks to give us the explanation by saying that Dr. didn't learn the lesson that Dr. Flew taught so well. Oh, how well he taught it. that it is a gradual process. But I want you to notice how he answered the question, the very first question on last evening. Number one, true or false? Every precisely stated proposition is either true or false. And he said true. All right, here is a precisely stated proposition. Everything that exists or ever has existed is either human or non-human. But both he and Dr. Flew have to envision something in between that was neither human nor non-human. Here he has taken the position, of course, in recognition of the law of excluded middle, that everything that exists either possesses a certain property or it does not. But now what does all of this speech to which you just listened amount to? Nothing. It amounts to a denial of what he here admitted, what on this question he said was the truth, and now he comes up with all of this talk about baldness in Latin by an effort to deny it. Well, let me take up his speech item by item and passage by passage before we get back to our affirmative argument. How much did you hear about his taking up my affirmative analysis? That step-by-step analysis showing that his denial of it could not be true. How much did you hear of it? I ask you to ask yourself honestly and sincerely, how much did you hear about it? That was an affirmative argument set out in precise, logical form, put up where he could see it, where he could go down the line, item by item and passage by passage, where he could show that it was valid, invalid if it were, where he could show there was a false premise if there were any. What did he say about it? Nothing. What did he do? He came back and denied what he had admitted on Tuesday night. He took exactly the same tactic that Dr. Flew did, namely to deny the law of excluded middle after having admitted it. All right, let's go through it. There is the old prejudicial tactic. Again, it's an appeal to prejudice. If I were here debating Mrs. O'Hare, that's what I would expect. She's a fellow traveler of his, and he tried the other day to repudiate her on television. But Dr. Matson, you've joined her. You make the same kind of effort she does. That's an appeal to prejudice. Actually, a rejection of the law of rationality, when every philosopher of any worth ought to recognize that we should draw only such conclusions as are warranted by the evidence. Oh, we've got the monkey trial. I wrote a letter to the editor of one of the newspapers recently after they had been talking about, have we got to have the monkey trial all over again? What are we to do? To sit down and let the biologists tell us about our origin? Dr. Matson says, just as Dr. Flew did, oh, I'm not an expert in biology. Dr. Matson, I've talked to biologists, I've talked to paleontologists, I've talked to chemists, biochemists, and so on and so forth. I have said, can you tell me which was first on earth, a woman, a human female, or a baby? Not a single one of them has ever tried it. I wrote to all this great array of experts to which he refers, and I suppose to which he had reference when he handed me this magazine, of the, I think, 100 signers this manifesto, and I asked the question, which was first on earth, a woman or a baby? Will you please tell me not when but how that which had no life became alive, and that which was alive but was not human became human? About 50 of those 106 answered. Most of them answered with some sort of smart aleck remark, but not one single one of them tried to answer either one of the questions. They did just what Dr. Matson has done. You listen to see if he will try to tell you how the first human being came into existence from that which was not human. And you listen to see if he will tell you when something that didn't have a human respiratory system turned into something that did have it. Then you will have something, Dr. Matson, and all of your talk about Latin and baldness has nothing whatever to do with it. Now, to set you straight on that, if you want to say that a language is either Latin or not Latin, as this proposition said, and Dr. Matson himself even underlined the word precisely, if he and I are going to talk about whether there really is the Latin language, then we will have to have the precise definition of the Latin language. And if we want to talk about the Spanish language, then we will have to have the precise definition of the Spanish language. But if we had such a thing, then we could talk about whether Jones or Smith is talking Latin or whether he's talking Spanish. If a person is bald or not, what do you mean by the word bald? Dr. Matson, I remind you, every precisely stated proposition is either true or false. I didn't say that just in every proposition is true or false, but every precisely stated proposition is true, and that's what you said. Now, if you define bald as being a man who has 100 hairs on his head, and a man has 99, a man who is not bald has 100, and a man has 99, then he's bald. If he has 100 or 101 or more, then he's not bald. You see, that isn't very difficult, is it, Dr. Matt? All that you had to say about that's gone by the wayside. Now, what are you going to do? Well, he said, I'm surprised that Dr. Warren is a member of the American Philosophical Association, the Southwestern Philosophical Association, the Tennessee Philosophical Association. You skipped that one. And this Philosophy of Science Association. What am I supposed to do, Dr. Matson, when I join one of those associations to say, listen, I want to get a message from Wallace Matson and he'll tell me what to believe. And as soon as I find out, when he says, can't you just see that? Can't you just feel it? Why, then I'll have to accept it. Or whatever I hear them say in those various discussions, why, I just must accept it. Oh, Dr. Matson, in the philosophy classes that I've had, even the ones at Vanderbilt, said, no, don't do that. Demand the evidence. Doesn't matter to whom you're speaking. Friends, I want to appeal to you to demand the evidence of the Word of God. I want to appeal to every religious person, members of the church as well, members of Christianity as well as every other religion. Come and examine the truth, examine the evidence, and draw that conclusion. I want to make this appeal aside to members of the Lord's church to realize that Dr. Flew and Dr. Matson are among the greatest defenders. They are the most able, among the most able men to defend this position. The weakness of what you're hearing is not the man, it's the position. Ought this not to arouse you to say, let us go back into the world. Let us carry Christianity. Let us bring back the schools to where they used to be. In some of my study for my doctoral dissertation, I went back in the theological journals, way back to their beginning, even back to Harvard Theological Review. There you would find articles proving the existence of God, talking about the inspiration of the Bible. Now go and try to find it. Find it at Berkeley, California. Just what kind of product is turned out by men who listen, boys and girls who listen to the doctrine of Dr. Matson. Fornication, nothing wrong with it. Homosexuality, nothing wrong with it, as long as it doesn't harm somebody else. Little wonder then that we have the kind of situation that we have. Friends, there is not any man, so far as I'm aware, and I've talked to a great many scientists, and I've studied philosophy of science, though I do not claim to be any great expert in it. But I've asked various scientists, and they came to this class. Here's a biologist, a chemist, a biochemist, a paleontologist, and we had the opportunity to ask, would you, as simply a biologist, attempt to prove evolution from biology alone? No, I would not. Would you, as a chemist, attempt to prove evolution by chemistry alone? No, I would not. Would you, as a paleontologist, attempt to do it? No, I would not. What would you do? I would try to synthesize the evidence from all of the various scientific disciplines. What a question. Is the synthesization of the information from the various scientific disciplines science or philosophy? It's philosophy, isn't it? Dr. Matson, as I told Dr. Flew, you're exactly prepared to deal with this issue of evolution. Now you need to get on with it. Face the problem not of when did human beings come into existence. That isn't what I ask. I ask you, how did they do it? Now, friends, everything that now exists on this earth is either a rock or it isn't a rock. Everything on this earth is either black or not black. Everything's either white or not black. Everything is either white or human or not human. Do you realize that the one and only argument these men have against the view that creation is true and evolution is false is that there was something that was neither human nor non-human, which is a denial of what they teach in their classes in the law of excluded middle, that every precisely stated proposition is either true or false, and that law as it pertains to objects is that every object either has a certain property or it does not. Now, all of his illustration about Latin was nothing more than Dr. Flu's argument that at one time there were some things that were neither human nor non-human. Well, I said, give me an example. He said, well, senile old persons. All right, then. We can throw them out to the dogs, can't we, Dr. Matson? Can we leave them out on the hill for the wolves? The Nazis were right. If you've got people that are senile, get rid of them. Use them for medical experimentation in whatever way you want. I tell you, friends, it is indeed a dangerous doctrine to which you've been listening tonight, and one that is false to the very core. I don't have to depend on biologists to make my decision about my origin, Dr. Matson. I may gain information from biologists and biochemists and paleontologists and archaeologists and so forth, but it's still my responsibility, as every philosopher worth his salt will teach. Draw only such conclusions as are warranted by the evidence. Who else would I ask, Dr. Matson, that would be more qualified than the signers of the Evolutionist Manifesto to give me the argument? I wrote to an anthropologist, author of a book that thick on anthropology, had 8 chapters on evolution, a visiting professor at the University of Arizona from the University of Minnesota. I said, I read your 8 chapters on evolution. I did not see your argument. Where is this premise, this premise? Therefore, this conclusion follows. I know that man evolved from that which was non-human. He wrote back and said, I'm not interested in any such simplistic formulation. Well, neither is Dr. Matson, and neither is any other evolutionist that I've ever encountered. What kind of response do they make? Oh, remember the monkey trial down in Dayton, Tennessee. And that's supposed to take care of it. That's supposed to say, all you ignorant people down in Tennessee, you know absolutely nothing about science. I'll challenge any scientist in the world or any evolutionist in the world to set out the proposition or the argument that has the premises, a valid argument, the conclusion of which is, therefore, no. Human beings owe their ultimate origin to evolution from non-living matter, from that to life that was non-human, and from that to human. Dr. Matson, that's a challenge I give to you. I ask you to come up here and answer it. Now, don't you let this speech close without dealing with that. Dr. Matson admitted on the first night that not a single human being now living on this earth owes his birth to being born of an ape. Notice I didn't say ape. Of course, he can try to raise prejudice by just saying ape. I said, or any other non-human thing. Now living, nobody now living owes their origin to birth from an ape or any other non-human thing. And nobody that ever lived in the past owes it. In the last question, he admitted that nobody now living owes their origin to being transformed from an ape or any other non-human thing. Can you imagine an ape walking through the woods one day? Time T-sub 1, he's an ape. He lifts up his foot, he's an ape. But when he puts it back down on the ground, he's a human. That's what Dr. Matson's got to believe, something like that. There comes a split moment in time, time T-sub 1. This thing alive, we'll just give him credit now for having something alive from non-living matter, is non-human. In the next split second, Dr. Matson, you could have 100 billion trillion years back out there, and you still got to come to that moment. Here's something non-human, and in the next moment it's human. Now let's see you explain it otherwise. I don't care how much gradual change there is, there still has to come something, even though he's ever so close to being human, he's not human. What is a human being? A human being is something that's born of a human that owes its ultimate origin to the creation of God, and I've proved that here tonight. And he hasn't paid any attention to the details of the argument. If you want to know what Dr. Matson said tonight, you can go back and read the Flu debate and read it perhaps given a little better with a little more tact. All right, let's see if we have covered everything you had to say. And I believe that we have. Except the last thing he did was to give me the gift of the Scientific American. I already subscribed to it in the past, and it's not in our library, Dr. Matson, and I read it regularly, so thank you very much just the same. Now, I want to look at 4I again before we close. I've given this orally, but I want you to see it. Dr. Matson, I want you to look at it. You have admitted propositions 4 and 5. No human being now living or past was born of ape or any other non-human thing. No human now living or past was ever transformed into some human being from something that was non-human. Don't let him blind you by this. Oh, it was gradual. Dr. Warren knows nothing about biology. Why, he says, I'm embarrassed to have been brought here from Berkeley, that great center of learning, to come into the midst of such ignorance, of people who did not know that evolution occurred gradually. Let it occur, which I grant is a counterfactual hypothesis for the sake of argument. Let it have been changing gradually for 1 trillion years, if you want, Dr. Matson. It comes up now to this moment, it's not human here. And the next split second, it's human. Now, you tell us how it happened, will you? Notice he admitted in 6, not by birth and not by transformation. He knows the logical move. I surely don't need to explain it to him. Surely I don't need to give you that logic lesson, Dr. Matson. It is therefore false, the disjunction by birth or transformation. Therefore, going back up to since in 3, since evolution, if evolution's true, then it is either by birth or transformation. And if it is false, by either birth or transformation, then evolution is false. And if evolution is false, then creation is true. If creation is true, then theism is true, or God exists. And if God exists, then atheism is false, and my case is established. I've established my case in an affirmative way. I'm here showing you that he admits everything I have said to you about it. Now, I want to go ahead with my affirmative argument in the little bit that I have left. I have shown you that God is self-sufficient. God is the one and only self-sufficient being. It is he who we must look to account for a human being, because of the information that I gave you about the fact of the human body, of the cardiovascular system. I now turn to the fact that God is good. God is good and God is just. First, let me talk about the fact of the goodness of God. He is infinite in goodness. He loves all men. He loves Dr. Matson. I love Dr. Matson. Tonight, in any way, an act of any indication of lack of love for him at all. As Stephen said, is recorded in Acts chapter 7, in speaking to the Jews, you stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart, you do always resist the Holy Spirit. But then, because of their anger, as they began to kill him by stoning him, he lifted up his eyes to heaven, and seeing Jesus standing at the right hand of God, cried out, Lord, lay not this sin to their charge. I say that to emphasize to you that while I work strongly against his argument, I do so for his benefit as well as for you, with a sincere hope that he will see the truth and come to understand the great God of heaven and the Son that he gave to die for us.
Dr. Warren is a very difficult process, and I am pessimistic about my being able to accomplish anything. But at least I think I can show you, and I think I made a beginning, that what is rather absurd in the position being held here. Most of my points, it seems, go straight past him. He's still maintaining that every precisely stated proposition is true or false, which I admitted, and then saying it follows that everything is either human or non-human is precisely stated when I gave human as exactly an example of a non-precise, namely fuzzy statement, fuzzy concept. So what is one to do in such circumstances? I guess just go ahead and hope that if it doesn't catch on Dr. Warren, it will on someone else at least. And so maybe I'm not completely wasting my and your time. Before I shall then just continue my presentation and use what time remains to answer some of the points that he's brought up. I won't be dictated to as to which ones. I will, however, cover all of them that I noted as far as time permits. and maybe tomorrow night, since I will have very little more positive to say. First, though, just so that I don't forget it and let it pass, I do want to get one point across. It's brief but important. Dr. Warren quoted from the Warren-Flu debate that when Flu was asked to give an example of something that was neither human nor non-human, he gave senile old persons. And then Dr. Warren, with his usual logic, ascribed that view to me. In fact, when I read the Warren-Flu debates, I was shocked when I came to that. I thought, oh, Tony has really made a blunder there. And that's still my opinion. I mean, that it was a rhetorical blunder and of a particularly unfortunate sort. And I would by no means give an example like that. If asked to give my example of something that is neither human nor non-human, I would mention something like Homo erectus. It just depends on what you want to say as to whether Homo erectus is human or not. He's in the chain from the original primate to the human being. If you want to say he's human, okay, say he's human. If you want to say he isn't, okay. The fact of the matter is that there isn't any ladder evolution, there is only a ramp. And who is to say, except quite arbitrarily and unusefully, where non-human leaves off and human begins? I'm trying to explain to Dr. Warren wrote to the 100-odd eminent evolutionists, and they all gave him the cold shoulder. I'm not surprised. They're busy men, and when a question like that comes in the mail, what are they going to do? I am trying, patiently, you will notice, to explain to Dr. Warren not what the answer to his question is, but why he shouldn't have asked the question. I haven't completed my explanation, but I think I have given enough of it so that he could get the general drift. As I said, I will, if necessary, repeat it. I'd rather avoid that, though. Well, I was talking about linguistic evolution. I pointed out, and this got completely past him, that you can't even in principle give a yes or no answer to the question, is this sentence Spanish or is it Latin? That if you tried to define things so precisely that you could, your definition would only be done by enumerating all the sentences in the Spanish language, or rather, in what you arbitrarily chose to call the Spanish language. And that would get us nowhere. I hope that that point at least was heard this time, Dr. Warren, and I hope that overnight it might even be digested. I am really of a very optimistic nature. Well, let me continue. I began to talk about linguistic evolution a little bit. I pointed out that it certainly occurs, no one would deny this, that it does have the feature that there is a penumbra between Latin and Spanish, where it's a merely arbitrary and unuseful matter whether you're going to call it late Latin or Old Spanish. And I might point out all kinds of periods when, even if you did refine your views very, very closely, you'd find that, well, this person was speaking late Latin and then he relapsed into Old Spanish, or somebody in the family did one and the other, and oh, why bother? Let me talk about a few more features of linguistic evolution. Again, a relatively non-controversial and non-emotional subject. One thing to notice is that the unit of linguistic evolution, that is, the entity that does the evolving, is not the individual speaker's speech. Time? Don't I have 20 minutes? This is a negative. I got 15 minutes yet. Don't cut me off. Yes, I was sure I did. Okay. What is it that evolves? when Latin evolves into Spanish. It's not the individual speaker's speech. That tends to remain pretty constant through a lifetime. I don't say that everybody in his old age has exactly the same speech patterns and habits as when he was young, but on the whole, unless he's moved or something into a new community, he will be speaking pretty much the same. That doesn't change. It relatively doesn't. What evolves is the speech of the whole population of intercommunicating people. This as a whole, we might call it the language pool. The people who talk to each other and are understood by each other. Now that, you see, starts out Latin and ends up Spanish. The change, that pool that starts out Latin changes. Notice, please, it's made up of individual speakers, none of whose speech habits are exactly like anybody else's. But the preponderance, we can say that they're all similar, or they couldn't communicate, and that some speech habits are perhaps more preponderant than others. There might be something that's called standard Latin or court Spanish or something, the sort of thing that academies and dictionaries are always trying to get fixed. You know, the idea of this, the Académie Française writing the French dictionary that's to tell you what pure French is forever. Well, it's generally recognized now that that is a hopeless task. Languages necessarily change. You cannot stop this, and you shouldn't try. No point in it. I say this speech of the whole population of intercommunicating people changes. It changes as fads, economic conditions, invasions, and consequently importation of new words, new activities, etc., a myriad of them, result in changes in the proportion of expressions of certain sorts. This process of change, moreover, whereby we get from Latin to Spanish, is not directed. There is no goal of it. It has no goal. It would be very naive indeed to suppose that some Dark Age peasants set out on the arduous task of initiating Castilian. And it would be still more naive to suppose that the great spirit of language was struggling to get Castilian born. I think I don't have to labor this point. There's no direction, there's no goal in going from Latin to Spanish. After, you can say, well, that's where it ended up, but it wasn't the goal that all this was working toward, either consciously in the speakers or consciously in some directing force, because there wasn't any. I think even Dr. Warren might admit that in the case of language, etc. That's one thing to notice. There's no direction, no goal to this process. It doesn't even stop. It's going on today, as I pointed out with English. And furthermore, the individual changes, the grand, vast summation of which constitutes the whole change in the intercommunicating population, these individual changes are more or less random. They are, if you like, due to chance. At any rate, they aren't, in the first place, intended. And yet, they do follow laws. That is to say, we can explain the changes, and even sometimes predict them. To take just one example, in the Latin language, the word for horse is equus. There's another Latin word, caballus, that means nag, broken down horse, or, well, nag is the English word for it. But linguistic change, this is a general feature of linguistic change, it tends to adopt the usages of the majority. Well, the majority, as we learn from the Bible, are the poor. Well, the poor people in the Roman Empire, if they rode anything at all, rode nags, not horses. They rode cavalli, not equi. As a consequence of this, today, the Italian, however rich he may be, rides a cavallo. The Spaniard rides a caballo, and the Frenchman rides a cheval. This word equus died out. It left no descendants. But this Latin word caballus has a numerous prodigy. I think it's the case that some derivative from this is the word for horse in every modern Romance language. But if it isn't, it doesn't matter. Plenty of examples could be given. All these features of linguistic evolution have their parallels in organic evolution. The first thing to notice is that the unit of organic evolution is not the individual organism. It's not you or me, or this cat or that dog. It's not what the biologists call the phenotype. But as with language, the unit of evolution is the interbreeding population, the gene pool or genotype. That genotype is what, as a whole, changes. And like linguistic change, the change in the genotype is not directed. There's no preset goal for it. The end is not foreseen. There are disanalogies between organic evolution and, or at least differences between organic evolution and linguistic. For example, the change in a biological genotype is, of course, infinitely slower than linguistic change. But the change follows similar principles. That is to say, they can both be explained by selection from mutations. Mutations are the essentially random element which produce something new under the sun. These go on all the time. The selection is the non-random element. It is that by adaptation. In my example of equus and caballus, I explained why caballus won out. It was, so to speak, to use a very old term in these evolutionary debates, the fittest, or rather the most adaptive, because it was that which occurred in the speech of most people. Now, perhaps in trying to meet some of Dr. Warren's objections, perhaps tomorrow night I will have some more to say in detail about evolutionary theory, unworthy as I am to lecture on it, but nobody else, I guess, is going to do it, and it seems important to do it at this time and place. I'll just end that presentation by a short remark, which will perhaps say something about where I hope to get. The reason why this account of the origin of things ought to be accepted, and the other million, which I indicated, ought to be rejected. And by the way, there are certainly as many accounts of the origin of man as there are of the origin of the universe. The reason we ought to accept this one, the evolutionary account, is that this is the only one that is based on the painstaking collection of evidence, formation of hypotheses to explain the existence and nature of that evidence, testing of the hypotheses, and modification and improvement of the hypothesis in the light of further evidence and testing. In a word, this is scientific. I've tried to explain what at least I conceive to be a scientific process, and not just to try to overawe you with the word science. The other accounts of the origin of the world and of man, including that in Genesis, are myths, stories made up for various reasons, generally with little or no attention to the evidence. This is not necessarily the fault of those who made them up, but nevertheless not good warrant for acceptance, especially when we have so much better an account. Now let me see if I can take up some of the things that Dr. Warren has talked about. He did say a few more things about evil, and he said that God loves Dr. Matson. Well, I'm glad to hear it, although if I do wake up burning in hell, I guess the first thing I'll exclaim, if I can, if my mouth is still there, is that Jewish saying, with friends like this, who needs enemies? Let's see. Here, Dr. Warren said that I denied the law of excluded middle. Well, the law of excluded middle is that, as he put it, that every, let's see if I can remember Aristotle's formulation. It is not the case that anything both is and is not at the same time in the same respect. Well, I subscribe to this. That every precisely defined statement is either true or false is a fair enough approximation to it, I guess. But if one is going to subscribe to that, one must notice the existence of fuzzy concepts, as I've tried to enlighten Dr. Warren. And it's not that statements involving fuzzy concepts are exceptions to the law of excluded middle. It's just that it doesn't apply to them. He said, well, I see I've dealt with a lot of these things. He said again and again, I guess I'll take this up, I have a moment. He said again and again, not just tonight, that I said in my book that there is no such thing as spontaneous generation, but as an evolutionist, I'm committed to it, so that's a contradiction, or an abandonment of the case or something. This is what I mean by quoting out of context, which I courteously requested Dr. Warren tonight to cease, but he didn't. I don't have my book here, but I remember pretty well the context of that remark. I was talking about Pasteur and Pasteur's refutation of spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation in that context, and please notice that words may have different meanings in different contexts. As say, stock means one thing in the stock market, and quite another if you're planting flowers, and still a third if you're making soup, and so on. What I was talking about was the view that existed in Pasteur's time that not just the very first living organisms, viruses or subviruses, might evolve from non-living things, but rather the view that worms, horseflies, even mice were spontaneously generated in old piles of rubbish and slime and so on. That was the spontaneous generation which Pasteur refuted. Pasteur was not concerned with, in his experiments, anything to do with the origin of the very first steps toward what we might call life from non-life. Incidentally, here's another pair of fuzzy concepts. It's quite impossible to say, except by being arbitrary, of everything at all. Is this living or is it non-living? Is this virus a living thing? Well, it has some of the properties of living things, namely it reproduces and so on. But then it lacks other properties of living things. It has no metabolism. Or if I've got that right, I said I'm not a biologist. So, are you going to define a living thing as what has a metabolism as well as reproductive power, or not? It's simply arbitrary and a quite uninteresting question of terminology. Thank you.
I'm happy to be before you for my last speech of the evening, a very brief 5 minutes. It seems to me that it ought to be obvious to all of us that Dr. Matson did just exactly as I predicted he would do, that he would not pay attention to the argument which I've been presenting in detail. He has not really dealt in a way that would deal with the argument which I have given. I am so much impressed with the fact that he has I read what Dr. Flew has said and has tried to imitate him, that at one point I even wrote Flew is saying thus and so, and had to go back and scratch it out. I was impressed at the point with the fact that when there's something that he doesn't know how to answer, he gives us a long history of something. Dr. Matson, I suggest that you could have spent your time a little better in answering the argument and giving a long history of language. It seems to me, and I want to be sure I don't quote you out of context, were you in your argument on the genotype trying to say now that apes gave birth to human beings? Will you please answer that question in your next speech? Let me have that magazine right over there, please. He's left us with the impression that all agree and is just established beyond doubt. That simply is not so. And even if scientists did conclude it, that would not prove it. We do not have to sit by and let a biologist decide what our origin is. But Dr. George Wald of Harvard University, biology professor, Nobel Prize winner, and leading evolutionist, very openly expressed the situation relative to spontaneous generation. One has only to contemplate the magnitude of this task, evolution of primeval life from inorganics, to concede that the spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. And there are a number of other scientists on this same page that I could quote if I had the time, but I don't. But speaking of taking things out of context, I'll have time, I suppose, to do this at least. Dr. Matson last night took my book, Have Atheists Proved There's No God, took the matter out of context and completely misapplied it. On page 32, the bottom at the top, 33, I said, no power, not even infinite power, can create a being who is a free moral agent and who is yet beyond even the possibility of sinning. This is the case because the possibility of evil is analytical to the definition of moral agency. And he raised the point that this puts me in contradiction when I answer the question saying that since God, in the sense that God always does good, then he is a moral agent. Now my statement here in this book refers to a created being, a contingent being, one who depends for his existence upon the mighty creative act of the non-contingent, self-existent being who is God. I have made the point that no power, not even infinite power, can create a being who is free moral agent and who yet is beyond even the possibility of sinning. This is the case because, as I said, the possibility of evil is analytical to the definition of moral agency. Now note carefully what I had in mind in this statement. God always acts in harmony with his own infinite goodness because he has the infinite power to control every situation. He always uses his infinite goodness and justice correctly because his infinite power is controlled by his infinite goodness and knowledge. Now that takes care, Dr. Matson, of that misrepresentation and taking matters out of context. He used an illustration about a blowtorch and asked if I would use a blowtorch on my son in punishment. No, Dr. Matson, I would not. You admitted that one man could punish another. You admitted that one man could punish even such a terrible criminal as Hitler. Would you have used a blowtorch on Hitler? What he's trying to get at is here, if you would not punish one severely, this shows that God would not punish man severely. No, all this shows is that I do not have the infinite concept of God or of sin that no way that I could know the enormity of even one sin, except the great God of heaven would tell me. I cannot by philosophical reason know what ought to be the punishment for my sin, but God has revealed it to me by telling me that the only way out of it is by the gift of my Son. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us and gave his life on the cross that we might be saved from our sin. But God then tells us that if you reject it, then you shall be punished forever. That is, as a matter of retribution. The suffering in hell is not evil. It is retributive. The wages of sin is death. The Greek word opsonion means what you have earned by what you have done. Dr. Matson has really paid no attention to my carefully formulated argument on the reasons for punishment, deterrence, reformation, and retribution, and that most fundamental, in which I'm sorry to say our American society is largely forgetting, is retribution. We cannot reform criminals until we can bring them face to face with the fact that they deserve the punishment which they are being given. But if we send them to prison and they are made to feel sorry for themselves as if they're mistreated because they're in prison, even though they've held up a grocery store and murdered the man and wife who run it. Oh, you poor little fellow in prison. We need to help them to see they deserve what they're getting. Now, the Bible tries to help us to see that sin is a violation of the law, of the will of Almighty God. He doesn't want us to do it. His ideal will is that no one would ever sin. He created this world as a place for man's habitation, to make up his mind whether he will love and serve him or not. God pleads with man not to sin. That's his ideal or intentional will for us all. His will in the circumstance of our sin is that we will respond to his gracious offer of his Son. The cross lets us know that we cannot save ourselves, that we must be saved by the grace of God, by the blood of Christ. But God warns us that if we reject it, we will be lost. God's warning of punishment should be a deterrent to go into it in the first place. And his warning of what will happen if, having gotten into it, we do not come out of it, should lead us to reformation, to rehabilitation, spiritually as it were. But then if in the face of all of that we continue our lives and refuse to do so, and go out through the door of death into eternity, then we shall stand before God in judgment to hear the words that will set us away from God and everything that's good once and forevermore. And that will be a matter of retribution of what we deserve. My friends, I think you can see that we have not heard this affirmative speech replied to tonight.
Glory be. Dr. Warren and I finally agree on something. I agree, I think, with the substance of Dr. Warren's complaints on what is sometimes called the coddling of criminals. I don't know whether we agree in the philosophies behind it, but I do think that as a matter of fact, the criminal justice system is not doing what it ought to do, and that a misguided tenderness for criminals probably has something to do with this, though I think that the failure to apprehend any significant portion of them has even more. But that, of course, is entirely irrelevant to our subject, so I won't pursue it. Was I trying to say that apes gave birth to human beings? No, I was trying to say that you shouldn't even ask whether that did or didn't happen. Let's see, I have something. Dr. Warren says that I quoted him out of context when I quoted his statement that possibility of evil is analytic to moral agency. He says now, well, he only intended that to apply to human beings, not to God, as the context makes clear. Well, if so, then I'm afraid he's guilty of a contradiction, which only, I think, makes matters worse, because not even putting God in can possibly make it okay to say, well, this concept applies to all those, but not to those under that one under completely different rules. You see, he wants to say that God is a moral agent, but this conflicts with his whole tie-up between moral agency and the possibility of sin and his illegitimate transition to the actuality of sin. So he is in a bind. But he shouldn't accuse me of quoting him out of context, because I didn't. Let's see. He said I just about accused me of plagiarizing Flew, except for a new illustration, he says. Well, I think I explained that I was trying to succeed where Flew had clearly failed, and by it, I put quite a bit of store in the illustration, which I very carefully prepared, and I thought it might do the job. But, alas, it seems that it won't. All I can hope for now is that when this is printed up, Dr. Warren may go back and read it, and maybe someday the light will dawn. Well, let's see, what else here? It's quite a lot, I guess. I'm going back here. Oh, he accused me again of subjectivism. He is very shocked that I said that fornication and homosexuality might not be wrong after all. Again, homosexuality and fornication don't exist. They aren't entities. There are only individuals who engage in this or that behavior. He says he was shocked, and he also said, well, who decides whether they're wrong or not? This is the subjectivism bit. Well, he wanted a standard or rule by which to decide. I gave it to him. It's the one I use, which I say goes back to Aristotle. An activity is wrong if it seriously frustrates or interferes with the expression of a human being's potentiality. And okay otherwise. I don't have to say or harms people, because harming people is interfering with the expression of their potentiality, so it would be redundant. Now, if somebody engages in activities of this description, which do in fact get in the way of the expression of what he is, well, sure, I guess it's wrong. If they debilitate him or impoverish him or make him all broken up or something like that, he better not do it. But as long as it doesn't harm anybody, I don't think other people ought to interfere except by exhortation, unless it results in harm to somebody else. That seems to me a very pedestrian, but as far as my lights tell me, adequate kind of moral rule to go by. All right, thank you. Thank you. We'll continue this tomorrow, I guess.
We only have one more evening for this continuation of debate. I hope that you'll return tomorrow at 7:30. Until then, you're dismissed.